So Deep Rock Galactic Season 5 is here. Well, not necessarily. It is here, but it's also not here. Let me explain. While the update itself has not been officially released, you can play the beta experimental branch if you have the Steam version of the game. It came out a couple of days ago, and I have been playing it basically non-stop since it came out. It came out immediately after the narrated trailer was released. And in it, you can play the new mission type, you can experience the new enemies, the new seasonal event, and all the stuff that comes with it. And since today, as of the recording of this, marks the 1 week countdown to the release of actual Season 5, I thought it would be interesting to go through and talk about my first impressions of the season in terms of what we got to play in the beta and what I think is good, what I think is bad, which most of it is good. Trust me, this season is shaping up to be incredible. And just my overall thoughts and first impressions on what this season is showing up to be. A couple things to mention. First, we are talking about the experimental beta branch, so a lot of the things that I talk about might be different by the time the season actually comes out. Some things might be tweaked, some enemies might be changed, some mechanics might be a little bit different, so keep that in mind that some of the things I mention might not be the same as when the season actually releases. And also, for the bulk of this, I'm going to be talking about the main big things that are coming out with the season. So I'm not really going to be talking too much about the cosmetic filtering, the new dances, although they are interesting to say the least. The seasonal switcher, because I didn't really experience too much of that. I'm not going to be going too much into Hazard 5+. I did try it a little bit, but I got wrecked very quickly because I'm bad at the game. But I also purposely stuck with Hazard 4 and 5 to get a good idea of the kind of stuff that we were going to be experiencing with the season without being too overwhelmed, essentially. So starting off immediately, we will talk about the new mission type, the deep scan mission type. Right off the bat, this mission is a lot of fun. It is probably one of my new favorite mission types in the game. It is a good mixture of a lot of different aspects, and I think that it is a good addition to the mission roster in DRG. To give a quick walkthrough step-by-step of exactly how this works, when the mission starts up, first you have to find these resonance crystals, and the resonance crystals are how you figure out where the Morkite geode is, which is what you're basically trying to find in the long term. Now, these resonance crystals, you find them by using this tracker, which you guys can see on screen now, which basically is this sort of indicator. It's this proximity detector that lets you know how close you are to the resonance crystal. The closer you are to the crystal, the faster the ping will happen and the more full the bar will be when it pings. And then also next to the bar, you can see there is an icon. There is either a triangle pointing up, a triangle pointing down, or a diamond. If it's triangle pointing up, you know the crystal is above your current position. If it's pointing down, it's below you. And if it's a diamond, it's roughly at the same level that you're at right now. Now, if you are really far away from the crystal, the indicator will change to a blue pinging indicator, and it'll say distant. And it basically tells you that you are very far away from any current crystal. I will say this particular stage of the mission can be a little bit confusing to navigate. I'm not necessarily sure if I can chalk this up to the new cave generations and me not being used to them, or just me not being used to looking for these things entirely, but I do feel myself getting lost a lot of the time when we're in this particular stage in the mission. One thing that I think would help with that is if they added those directional indicators, the triangle and the diamond, to the blue indicators, the distant indicators, to still let you know, okay, you're far away from a resonance crystal, but it's still above your position, it's still below your position, or you're at the same level. That way you can look at the terrain scanner and say, okay, if I know I'm far away and I know it's above me, it's probably in this section of the cave that I have been to or I haven't been to. So that's the only real thing about this particular aspect of the mission that I probably am just not used to, is I do feel myself getting lost a couple of times, but ultimately it's not really that bad, and you only need to do this 3 to 5 times depending on the length of the mission. And if your teammates split up and you each tackle different resonance crystals, you can get this part done actually pretty quickly. It can take a little bit of time, again, if you get lost or if the terrain is kind of a bit weird, but mostly it's not really that bad. And then once you find the resonance crystals, all you have to do is hook them up to the scanners, which is basically the exact same thing as the rock crackers from the meteor drops, except for it is way less involved. You literally just call in the scanner, you connect it, you set it up, and then it's done. And then you just do that a couple of times. And then once you do that again 3 to 5 times, the drill elevator gets called in, and then that's when the next stage of the mission starts up, in which case you ride the drill elevator down. Now, the drill elevator phase is interesting because there's a bit of a ready check. They tell you to get armed up and get ready because all of you need to be on the drill elevator before it can go down. And in this section, you are riding the drill elevator down this massive tube while enemies are coming down at you. Very fun sequence. This is probably the funnest part of the mission, in my personal opinion, because these enemies are just coming at you. They're crawling down the tunnel that you're making, and it's just a lot of fun. The drill elevator will get damaged over time, and you will have to repair the buzzsaw modules that are sort of guiding the drill elevator down, and you will have to fix that. because if you don't, it will get stopped. And the drill elevator will get stopped a couple of times on its own just because it hits a dense patch of rock that it has to cut through. I will say I do think that the modules that you need to repair break a little bit too fast, a little bit too quickly. Maybe it might just be me, but I feel like every time I fix one, I look away for 2 seconds and then I come back and it's already almost broken again. So that's the only part of this particular section that I wish was a little bit different. It's still not really a big deal. It doesn't take away too much about it. I do just feel like they break a little bit too fast, especially when you're playing by yourself. When you're playing by yourself, you basically have to just be on constant watch of these things while also juggling the enemies. So maybe if they made it so that way, if there's less people, it doesn't break quite as fast or something along those lines. That's the only real thing I would say about this particular section. But then once you get down into the actual Morkite geode, for starters, the landscape is beautiful. It looks phenomenal. I absolutely love the way that they made this geode location look. Crystals are pretty. It's just overall a very pleasant area to be in. And then you just have to collect the Morkite seeds, which are very easy to find. Sometimes they can land in kind of weird glitchy spots. They can fall through the map a little bit, but I think that might just be because of the experimental build. Then you deposit them in the molly, and after that you call in for extraction, in which case the drill elevator opens up the experimental jet boots that you get, which are way better than the normal jet boots. They last, I think, a little bit longer. I don't know if they last any longer, but when they overheat, they essentially immediately cool down so you can use them again, because you're going to be using these things to fly up the tunnel that you just came down in order to get to the drop pod. One small thing is that Molly still just climbs up the tunnel to get to the drop pod, so it's great because you get up the tunnel very quickly, but then you still have to wait for her. I kind of wish they made Molly like a little bit faster or give her some sort of special way to get up there quickly, because it feels really cool to get out of the cave system like that, but then you're still just kind of at the drop pod waiting, and Molly's just taking her time going up this big tunnel, and sometimes you go down a very far distance, so she can be there for a while. But ultimately, I really like the way that this mission turned out. It's not super long. It can be a little bit time consuming depending on the complexity of the cave, and again, where the resonance crystals show up and how complicated they are to find. But for the most part, even with that, it still isn't too bad. I've had sections where it takes us maybe 4 minutes to find all of the resonance crystals, but then I've also had times where we've spent 20 minutes trying to find them just because one of them is just very, very tricky to come across, which I think the addition of cleaning up and maybe optimizing the scanner for the resonance crystals just a little bit, making it a little bit tighter, wouldn't be too bad of an idea, and I think would make situations where you get lost in the caves a lot less common. So, but ultimately this new mission type gets a seal of approval, and I absolutely love it. I think that this is going to be a phenomenal addition to the game, and I look forward to all the crazy strats that people have with this. The tunnel section is very fun, and there's a lot of really cool overclocks or strategies that could make that section even more fun and effective to go through. So, but then we have the new enemies, and thankfully, I have basically nothing but good things to say about the new enemies. In fact, might be a bit of a hot take, but I think some of them could be a little bit stronger, if I'm being honest with you. I don't know if I'm going to regret saying that, but some of them could actually be a little bit more powerful. Let's start with the Stalker, because the Stalker is probably the one that is the most, I don't want to say basic, but it's just a normal glyphid. It's in the glyphid family, so it's the one that kind of behaves most like other bugs in the caves right now. The Stalker is really not that bad. I was very worried. I know a lot of people were a little bit worried about the Stalker, but it really is not nearly as bad as I thought it was going to be. For starters, it's not very common. It is classified as a disruptive class enemy, which means there is a chance that it just won't spawn at all during the mission. It's not like the Stingtail or the Septic Spreader where they have a much higher chance of spawning, and you're probably going to see 1, 2, or at least a couple throughout the course of a mission. This thing will sometimes just not spawn. It will just not show up, so sometimes you don't even have to worry about this thing. That being said, when it does show up, it makes its presence very well known. It has a very, very distinct audio cry that lets you know that it's in the area. So even if it does show up, you know that it's there. And thank goodness it does, because this thing actually has a very good degree of stealth, which makes sense because it is a stealth ambushing predator. Basically, it has what I would call 2 levels of stealth. It has partial invisibility, where it has sort of that like bluish aura around it, where you can kind of see it, but not really, and it can kind of blend in a little bit. And then it just has straight up like full invisibility, where you just can't see this thing. You just have no idea that it's around, and unless you hear its cry, which you can hear it pretty well, you just don't know that this thing is around. That being said, it's still not that bad because it doesn't have super heavy armor like the Stingtail does. It actually, I believe, only has light armor, and it can be taken out relatively quickly. It's not that durable, but it is pretty powerful when it does get drop on you. Because of its shield disruption attack, it can debilitate you relatively quickly and make you more vulnerable to other enemies. So when you do hear the cry, you kind of do need to be aware that it's going to be in the area and sort of start scanning the crowds to try to figure out where the stalker is, because if it does get the drop on you, it is going to hurt a good amount. That being said, I think that the fear factor and scare tactic that this thing uses are very, very well executed. When I hear that cry, I get scared that this thing is around because I'm afraid I'm just about to get sideswiped by this invisible bug that I cannot see, and my shields are just going to be gone, and then I'm going to be left vulnerable for about 10 seconds, which is a very long period of time for your shields to not be functioning. But the fact that it's not that durable, it's not that common, and it's very, very obvious that it's around, even though the fact that it is technically stealthy, makes it so that way the stalker is not nearly as problematic of a threat as I thought it was going to be. It is still a good addition to the roster. In fact, I would even go so far as to say maybe a little bit of a bump to its health wouldn't be that bad of a thing, because this thing goes down pretty much almost as easily as a grunt. Like once you actually figure out where it is and you take it out, it goes down very, very quickly. So maybe a little bit more durability wouldn't be so bad on this thing. This is technically considered a higher class enemy, so I think that that would make a whole lot of sense. But overall, the Stalker is really not that problematic. It is disruptive when it does show up, and you do have to be careful around it, and you should definitely take it seriously. But we're not talking like a Stingtail situation where you're just going to be screwed up the moment this thing shows up. So, and then the Scale Bramble is really also not that bad. I've seen this thing several times so far, and it has never really been too much of an issue on its own, at the very least. The damage it does is pretty decent. It's about on the same tier as something like the Menace or the Spitters. They're relatively common. You will see them somewhat often, but because of the fact that the way that they spawn, because they just spawn when the level is generated, they don't spawn with swarms or anything, so a lot of the times you can just find these things by themselves and just take them out on their own, which makes it a lot easier. In terms of the sensory node positions, because I know a lot of people were worried about them being in very awkward or difficult positions or being super spread apart, for the most part, that hasn't been the problem. They've been pretty close together, and they've been pretty easy to take out. They don't take a whole lot of damage to take out, and then once you do, the Scale Bramble itself is pretty easy to take out. They're honestly relatively fragile. The projectiles that they fire are also easily dodgeable. They're easy to sidestep. They're easy to juke. So overall, this thing is not really that much of a threat, again, on its own. If you are on something like an escort duty and you enter a room and there's like two of these things plus the swarm coming after you, then I can maybe see this thing being a little bit more problematic. But at least on its own, in the situations that I've seen it in, unless it's like blocking a path and you have to like run past it to get to its sensory nodes, then it might be a little bit more problematic. I would actually like to see these things be a little bit tankier, just a little bit more, just because, again, kind of similar to the Stalker, they go down pretty quickly. Keep in mind, for the most part, I have experienced them on hazard level 4, sometimes on hazard level 5. I didn't do a whole lot of that, but I've been sticking mainly with hazard level 4. So that might be a factor as well, but I still think that even that, which is a completely respectable difficulty, they still could use a little bit more beef. And hopefully I don't regret saying that in a couple of months. And then lastly, we have the Barrage Infector, which are pretty common, surprisingly. I thought these things were going to be pretty rare, but I've been seeing them a lot every mission pretty much. And these things are big. These things are huge. They dwarf the regular Spitball Infectors. They're pretty strong, but also, weirdly enough, they're also pretty easily dodgeable because the spray that the projectiles that they shoot out have are pretty wide, so it's kind of easy for you to just sort of duck in between them. Weirdly enough, I feel like these guys are the most underwhelming of the new enemies, at least for right now. They're very big and intimidating, and they definitely do have the ability to carpet a large area with explosives, but they are, again, similar to the other enemies, kind of fragile. They don't really take a lot of hits, and they're pretty easy to take out when you do find them. Using things like freezing or lighting them on fire are insanely effective against these things. I've had situations where I basically just froze this thing and it just immediately fell apart. Like the health on it just disappeared. And I feel like for something like this, it should be a little bit more durable. I feel like the Barrage Infector, to an extent, is a little bit more fragile than a normal Spitballer, which doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. But then again, maybe I'm just overanalyzing things here, but it does seem that it is a little bit more fragile than a normal Spitballer, which doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. Like a hot take, I think that all of the enemies could actually do with being a little bit more durable, at least just a little bit tankier, because I feel like for the most part, they're a bit too easy to take out. And again, I hope I don't regret saying this in a couple of months, but in general, I do think that the new enemies are pretty well executed. They have good positions to be in. They're not too bad. They're not too oppressive. They're honestly, for the most part, relatively balanced, at least in my opinion. And I think that compared to the Stigtail and the Septic Sprayer that we got last season, they're in a much better place. Now talking about the seasonal event, the Core Stone. Holy sh! This is probably the best seasonal event that they have ever done in this entire game. It is insanely fun. It is very cool. The atmosphere and the presence that happens when the Core Stone just opens up those gateways to the Nether is the only real way that I can describe it. And the crawlers are just pouring out of the walls is insanely cool to see. I love the push into the more sci-fi direction that they're going with this, and I am very, very interested to see with what they go with the rest of this. The crawler design itself is just so unique and unlike anything that we have seen before, and the idea of this like sentient rock basically calling on these guys, it really puts the lore of the game specifically into a very interesting direction. If anything, this event just got me more excited for Rogue Core than anything else, because I know that this is basically just a taste of the kind of things that we're going to be seeing in Rogue Core. Not to mention the soundtrack that plays during this event is incredibly cool and unique. Also, I should probably make a disclaimer saying that during the beta, there was a bug going around where whenever you were doing this event, killing a crawler had a chance of crashing your game. And that did happen to me several times on stream and off stream. So I didn't get quite as much experience with it as I could, but I did get a good amount of experience with the event to be able to complete it a couple of times and see how it works. That being said, the crawler itself is kind of durable for how small and how fast it is. It does have heavy armor, I believe, on its head and on its back. Don't quote me on that, but I believe it does have heavy armor. But for how small and how fast these things move, they're kind of tanky. And because you fight a lot of them, it can get a little bit overwhelming sometimes. This event is hard, I will say. If you're not prepared, this event is kind of difficult. Things like armor breaking and elemental damage are probably the way to go to take these guys out. Just straight up raw damage is probably not going to do you too well. Other than that, this event is incredibly awesome, and I want to see a further expansion of this particular family of enemies, which we are going to see more of in Rogue Core. The devs did say that this is not going to be a family of enemies that's going to be expanded on too much in normal DRG, but in Rogue Core, we're going to be seeing a lot more of this particular type of enemy, which I am very much excited to see because it's so, again, unique and unlike anything that we've ever seen. And it just begs so many questions. Like, what is this stone? Why is it able to basically open up portals into the lower levels of Hoxus? And what is going on down there? What is the implication that this thing is giving us? What exactly is happening on Hoxus? Is this just a gigantic rock floating in space that has a lot of powerful minerals? Or is there something else bigger and way more powerful going on in the lower levels that we just have no idea about? Because this is not nature doing this right now. This is some sort of exterior force or something even more powerful than just nature working right now. But overall, phenomenal event, incredible implications, beautiful for expanding the lore, and I love this. Is definitely my favorite event out of everything that they've done. So now we have reached probably the biggest thing that people have been asking a lot about, or things that people have been looking forward to, which is the new overclocks for all the new weapons. We got 13 new overclocks total if you count one that got heavily reworked, one for each primary weapon. And honestly, they're all pretty cool or good. I don't think any of them are really bad in any way, shape, or form. And a lot of them make contenders for the best for their particular weapon. And the ones that don't are still very cool and interesting. I'm not going to go too much into detail about all of the overclocks. I'll probably save that for a video after Season 5 comes out where everything is more finalized and balanced, but I'll give a very quick summary of how they work and also what I think about them and how they function, and if I think that they're going to be pretty good in the long run. So for the Leadstorm, I think the Leadstorm's overclock is great. It basically allows you to reload the minigun. It allows you to use these coolant injectors that you can insert into the gun to remove all of the heat and make it not overheat. And so basically it allows you to keep the minigun going for pretty much infinitely as long as you have those coolant injectors at the cost of it heating up faster. And I think this is really, really great because it allows you to be more consistent and be more in control of when the gun is overheated versus not. And I think that this is going to be one that I'm going to use a lot. For the Thunderhead, we already knew about the mortar rounds, and it's a lot of fun. It is probably one of the more fun ones out of the new overclocks that they have had. It basically caused the Thunderhead to fire these lobbing super explosive projectiles that do heavy AoE damage that can cut terrain incredibly quickly. Is it going to be hyper meta? Probably not, but it is very fun, and it is also very effective at taking out gigantic groups of enemies, specifically in the deep scan mission type during the actual drilling sequence. It was a lot of fun to use this, and it was actually quite effective. So I think that gunner mains across the board are going to really enjoy this hyper explosive edition. Now, the Hurricane is where my opinion might differ from a lot of people. I thought that the cluster missiles were fine. I thought that they had a very interesting position and that they actually had a very cool idea. It just wasn't necessarily my style. I couldn't really get the hang of that one too much. I felt like the delay between when you could actually detonate the rockets to cause them to drop the clusters was a little weird. There was a lot of micromanaging that you kind of had to do because you're not firing the rockets at the targets, you fire them above the targets, and then you let the clusters rain down on top of them. So you had to kind of be a little bit more surgical with where you were firing the rockets, but also kind of not really because they were clustering. So it just felt like a bit of a weird choice for me personally. Again, it's not bad. I don't think this is going to be bad, and I probably just need to have a little bit more practice on this. But overall, it just wasn't necessarily my style, but I can definitely see this being very useful. Again, in the drilling sequence for deep scan, this was very, very useful because you could literally just fire up, detonate, and you basically hit the entire tunnel. So the Warthog's pump action overclock was beautiful. I absolutely loved it. The sound design, just the feeling of just pumping the shot. Oh, it was so good. That being said, is it going to be meta? No, absolutely not. It is not going to be meta in any way, shape, or form. It does make the shotgun a lot more powerful, but it does not make it powerful enough to make it significantly more beneficial than normal. But it is a beautiful and fun addition to the Warthog that, even though it's not going to be meta, I'm probably going to be maining this for the rest of my existence. Now, the Smart Rifle's overclock is a very nice one, and I think that it actually makes the Smart Rifle a lot more accessible to a lot of people. It basically makes it fire automatically. You only can lock on to a couple of targets, up to 4 targets with maximum mod choice upgrades, and once you hit maximum locks, it automatically fires all those shots. So it's kind of just like a boom, 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 boom. It kind of makes it almost fire like a semi-auto rifle at that point. And it's very nice. It's very good. It kind of takes away the clunkiness of the Smart Rifle, in my opinion, where you're just sort of sitting there holding, waiting for the lock on, and then releasing to where it's just a little bit more consistent damage output. That being said, I could see why people might not get too used to this one. A, because the Smart Rifle is just a difficult weapon to use in general, but also because it doesn't have the same sort of flair that some of the other overclocks have, but I still think this is a very good one. Now, the Stubby is where we get to an interesting situation because there's actually 2 overclocks that the Stubby got. It got a new one and it got a reworked one. The new one is very nice because it basically just gives the Stubby a lot more range. It gives it a much tighter accuracy spread, gives it significantly enhanced weak point damage, and also gives it more recoil. So it basically makes it a lot more long range, which is something that the Engineer does not have a crazy amount of long range items. And I think that this is a perfectly valid option for the Stubby. And the other one that we got is a rework to its turret arc that makes it so that way, in addition to being able to charge up your sentry guns and make electrical currents go between them, you can also overcharge your platforms and basically turn them into electric landmines, essentially. They basically overcharge the platforms and make them electrified so that way they become hazards to anybody standing on them, which can make the platforms, again, a more offensive tool like something like Plascrete Catalyst, which I think is really, really interesting. It's a nice way to sort of combine the aspects of the Engineer, which the Engineer does a very good job of combining all of his tools together, and this is just another way around that. While I don't know how practical it's going to be, I can definitely see it being a very interesting thing on things like elimination missions or maybe even salvage operations, just something else for the Engineer to have area denial, which I think is great. Now, the Driller, his flamethrowers, like Fire Wave overclock, is a lot of fun, and it's honestly pretty effective. Basically, hold down the reload button and you fire out this big line of fire, which does a good amount of basic impact damage. It can do some pretty heavy chunk damage when it hits whatever it hits at the cost of a lot of ammo. And honestly, I think that this is just another very, very fun overclock. Is it going to be super duper effective? Maybe, maybe not. I'm not 100% certain, but at the very least, it's going to be fun. You're able to basically just case an entire tunnel with flames, and it's going to be a lot of fun. Now, the Sludge Pump's overclock is one that is focused around team play a lot. Basically what it does is if an enemy that is coated in the sludge is caught on fire, or if a puddle is caught on fire, or if a burning enemy is coated in the sludge, they will explode, or the puddle will explode. So Basically, it allows you to blow up your own sludge. Now, this is really good if you have somebody else who is running a very flame-based setup. So if you have, say, another driller on the team running a flamethrower, or if you have a gunner running his incendiary grenades, or a burning hell build, or just any sort of flame-based build, or even if you have an engineer with like a shard diffractor or something along those lines, or a scout with fire bolts on his crossbow, this could be a really interesting combination because you can essentially just blow up the entire battlefield, which is a lot of fun. How viable is this going to be? It's kind of hard to say. I need to get a little bit more experience with this one, but it definitely seems like a fun addition to the Sludge Pump's arsenal that I think is going to slot in very nicely with a lot of builds. Now, the Cryo Cannon's new overclock basically gives it its own version of the sticky fuel and the sludge that the other driller primaries have. It basically makes it that way. It creates these ice crystals when it hits the terrain and basically gives it its own lasting obstacle that it creates. I think this is a really good addition. I think this is something that the Cryo Cannon has been needing for some time, and I think that it is implemented very well. I think that it's pretty effective, especially on, again, the new deep scan mission type. You can just coat this on the walls as you go down, and the enemies have to cross it. They get hit with cryo, they get frozen, they get damaged. It's just an overall very good area denial overclock, and I could definitely see this being implemented in many good different ways. And then lastly, talking about the Scouts overclocks, the burst fire for the GK2 is solid. I'd say it's fine. It's definitely a very basic overclock. It basically just converts the gun to a 3-round burst, makes it fire a little bit faster, but makes the overall rate of fire slower because of the time in between bursts, and makes you a lot more accurate and gives you a lot more magazine size. Overall, I think this is fine. It's just a different way to use the GK2, and it especially rewards people who are good at hitting their shots, which I am not. And if you're somebody who finds yourself burning through GK2 ammo a lot, this is going to be a really good addition for you. The Drax overclock is honestly one of my favorites that they've made in this entire update because it is a very unique system. Basically, it causes its shots to cause the enemies to take more damage from elemental effects. So if you've ever played Borderlands 2 and you know the slag element, it's basically that. It causes the enemies to take more elemental damage, meaning it's easier for them to be lit on fire or frozen, and then they take more damage from those effects, including electrical effects as well. This is, I think, probably one of the best team-based overclocks that they've done. I think that in combination with a flame-based driller, an electrical-based engineer, or even just a flame-based gunner, this is going to be a very strong and powerful effect that's going to make elemental builds a lot more viable, which running this in conjunction with the driller that's running either the new flamethrower overclock or the new cryo overclock is going to be phenomenal and is going to do so much. And ultimately, I think that this is going to be one of the ones that I use a lot when I'm playing in teams, especially with a coordinated team that can all benefit from it. This is going to do some seriously good damage. And then lastly, we have the M1000 Classics Marked for Death, which we already saw spoiled to us before. This is the one where your focus shots don't do any real damage, but they mark the target, making them take more damage from all sources. This is a pretty good one. I really liked using this one. It does make it so that way you really just want to use your focus shots for those tougher targets because you also consume more ammo with each focus shot. So you really want to save those for those bigger threats and just use your normal shots to take out the smaller targets. That being said, it does make targets take a lot more damage. Things can be melted pretty quickly, and I can already see some very, very efficient Dreadnought destruction strats using this thing. And essentially, if you like leaning into a more supportive debuffing role, this is the perfect overclock for you for the Scout. So overall, with the new overclocks, I think they nailed them out of the park with these. I think these are all going to be very good. Yes, they're not new weapons, but in some cases, these are going to function like new weapons. And I think that they change up gameplay and are just going to open up the doors so much to some more build crafting options that I think that this is going to suffice in lieu of new weapons and give us just as much, if not more, stuff to work with. So in terms of the new mutators, the new anomalies, and the new hazards, I did have a little bit of experience with them. Secret Secondary was fine. It just gave you a second secondary objective to complete, which just could give you a bigger payout. And I did get to try the new secondary objectives, the Bob Articles and the Alien Eggs, and they were fine. They were just a nice change of pace from the normal different secondary objectives. I don't think that they're going to be game breaking in any way, shape, or form. It's just destroy X number of these things, and I think that it's just going to be a nice change of pace from the normal ones. In terms of Blood Sugar is a little bit interesting. I kind of had a fear when they first announced this, and it was kind of brought to fruition to an extent, where I was worried about situations where you just didn't have enemies to kill, and that happened to me a couple of times. where my health was just dwindling. I didn't really have anything, and I was just basically going down because there was nothing really to fight. Granted, when you do get into a very intense fight, you're practically unkillable because any enemy will heal you, which is kind of crazy. But that being said, in most cases, in most missions, you're going to have points or sequences where the enemy is just not attacking you. So you are just basically going to be sitting there taking constant damage and not have any way to heal off of it. So that's really the only issue I have with blood sugar. If they made it so that way there was constantly a stream of enemies coming at you, even if it was something really small, like just a couple of grunts at a time, or they made it so that way it wouldn't down you, it would just take you down to like 1 HP, which I think would still be perfectly fine, then it might not be quite as punishing for not having a lot of enemies around to take out. I'm not sure if I would even say that they should move this from an anomaly to a hazard, because we already have 2 hazards. But ultimately, I feel like the stress that this adds in kind of outweighs the goodness, especially depending on what mission type you're on. So on the topic of the new hazards, duck and cover definitely makes the game a lot harder in certain situations. It adds more ranged enemies to the cave, which is a lot of Bacteria, a lot of spitters, a lot of web spitters. And when they say more ranged enemies, they mean more ranged enemies. There was practically no melee-based enemies when I had this particular mutation a couple of times. And there were everything from, like I said, acid spitters to spitballers to Bacteria. It was a lot of ranged enemies. So if you have a gutter on your team with a shield, this is going to be very, very valuable in this situation. It definitely makes you have to think a little bit differently when you're going through the caves, but ultimately, I probably just need to get a little bit more practice with this one. And then the Ebonite mutation, I thought was going to be a lot more problematic than it was. It was still a little bit difficult to get used to because these enemies just pop up that you just can't get rid of. But the fact that the overcharged batteries come out of Molly does help out a lot because it means that you have them pretty easily accessible almost at all times. And it just kind of changes up combat to a little bit of a degree and makes you have to be a little bit more mindful of the types of enemies that you're going up against. And you can't just spray and pray and just take out everything. You have to be a little bit more meticulous. And the Ebonites don't show up a crazy often amount. They're steady, but they're not super duper in your face all the time. So it's not like you're constantly having to just run back to Molly to get an overcharger. You can have a little bit of a break every now and then, but you do have to keep in mind that they are going to be around. So ultimately, I don't think that these are really that bad. They're just stuff that people are going to have to get used to. And then the last thing I kind of want to talk about a little bit is the revamped escort duty mission. If you didn't know that they added a new attack to the Armor and Heartstone fight, which is a big crystal claw that can come up and basically encase you. It was a very different experience, and I honestly feel like maybe they updated a lot more because it definitely seems like escort duty missions are a little bit harder now. I feel like just the overall enemy density is a little bit higher, which I'm not sure if that was intentional or that's something that they just did, but they didn't say anything. But in terms of how this new phase in the Armor and Heartstone fight acts, basically the Heartstone will be coated in this like shield looking thing, and it will select somebody to mark, which you can see who's marked by this like trail of liquid or something going towards them. Then after a short period of time, they will get encased in this crystal claw, which you then have to bust out. It was a little bit difficult to get used to this new attack, especially since you don't want to be standing near Doretta when you do get hit by the claw, because I believe it will damage her. So if you find yourself being marked, you kind of want to get away from your teammates, get away from Doretta as quick as possible, which I think was the idea. They don't want people just sitting on Doretta and just babysitting her the entire time, which was a tactic that people were using a lot of the time for escort duties. So I think that they wanted to sort of handle that strategy to a decent extent by also giving the Armor and Heartstone a new attack, which I think they did pretty well. It was difficult to get used to, but once I did, it really wasn't that bad. You kind of just have to get yourself an opening to get out of the crystal shell. And then once you do, it goes away. And then once the phase is over, once the Armor and Heartstone does that like big explosion it does between each phase, all those crystals are destroyed. And then you're on to the next phase. So I don't really think it was that bad. It was honestly very nice to just see it shooken up to a decent degree. And I think that this is going to bring a new light to the escort duty missions and make them a little bit more enjoyable for people to go to. So in terms of overall major content, that was kind of all I really wanted to talk about and give my first impressions on the things that I had experienced and seen with the beta for Season 5. And so far, everything is looking really, really good. The new mission type is great. I love going through it. It's very fun, not too long, and it's also a little bit different. The new enemies, I think, are pretty well balanced. Honestly, in some cases, they could be a little bit stronger. Again, I don't want to regret saying that in a couple months, but I genuinely do think that they could be a little bit tougher. But overall, I think that they're actually very well implemented. The new seasonal event is by far the best season event that they have done so far in terms of just a coolness and immersion factor. It is just, they knocked it out of the park in expanding the universe as well. The new overclocks are a smashing success. They're all pretty good, and even the ones that aren't super good are at the very least fun to use and at least change up the weapon to a good degree. So I think they nailed it out of the park with that. The new mutators are very nice, and they change up the gameplay to a bit of a degree. I would like to see a little bit more tweaking with the blood sugar, but other than that, I think that they're fine. And again, a lot of the smaller things that I didn't talk about, like the cosmetic filtering, the new dances, the seasonal switcher, Hazard 5+, it's all there and it's all implemented pretty well. I just wanted to focus on the more bigger overall things that this season was adding in to see how well it was going to be done. Because these are going to be the main things that you're going to be experiencing, not just this season, but for the rest of the game, because these are evergreen stuff that's going to basically be in the game forever. Not saying Hazard 5+ isn't going to be, but not everybody's going to immediately jump to Hazard 5+. So anyway, those are my first impressions on how Season 5 is shaping up, and honestly, it looks phenomenal. Everything is looking great, and I just wanted to get my thoughts out there, let you guys know how I feel about this, because I have been streaming this and some people have been asking a lot of questions about how I feel about the new things that are coming out, so I figured I might as well just put everything together before the season officially releases. And remember that some of the stuff that I talk about might change by the time the season actually comes out, so keep that in mind as well. Anyway, I hope you guys found this video informative and enjoyable. If you did, please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and consider becoming a member, as it really helps out the channel and it tells me what types of videos you guys like to see. Rocket Stone Miners, I will see you in Season 5.